How do you get mesothelioma? Asbestos is the primary cause of mesothelioma. Inhaled asbestos fibers become lodged in the lining of the lungs, triggering an immune response that causes inflammation and scarring. Mesothelioma develops as a result of continued tissue and DNA damage after decades of asbestos exposure. When asbestos fibers travel to different parts of the body, it results in different types of mesothelioma. For example, pleural mesothelioma is caused when fibers get stuck in the pleura, which is the lining of the lungs. The peritoneal type is caused when fibers are deposited in the peritoneum, which is the lining of the abdominal cavity. Mesothelioma was virtually unknown until the 20th century. Mesothelioma incidence rates rose as industries expanded the use of asbestos. Check link in description for great offers. Primary risk factors. The majority of people who get malignant mesothelioma cancer were exposed to asbestos while working certain blue-collar jobs or serving in the military. About 80% of people diagnosed with mesothelioma have been exposed to asbestos. Risk factors for mesothelioma. Working at an asbestos mine or asbestos processing plant, working in a high-risk occupation such as construction or heavy industry, serving on military ships or facilities built with products containing asbestos, living in a residential area near an asbestos mine or contaminated site, disturbing asbestos products during a home renovation without proper safety measures. Smoking, on its own, does not increase the risk of developing mesothelioma. However, in combination with asbestos exposure, it can increase the risk of other types of lung cancer. While age, gender and overall health do not affect the risk of developing mesothelioma, these factors can affect overall prognosis and survivability after a mesothelioma diagnosis. Video of mesothelioma expert Dr. Jacques Fontaine explaining who is most at risk for mesothelioma due to asbestos exposure. Dr. Jacques Fontaine talks about the different people who are at risk of developing mesothelioma. Where does asbestos exposure occur? Asbestos exposure primarily happens in a workplace setting. It can also happen at home and in the natural environment. Asbestos was widely used in thousands of commercial, industrial and domestic products. Examples include drywall, insulation, piping, glues and adhesives, ceiling tiles, cement and shingles. Workers who manufactured or used these products were exposed to asbestos on the job. Others, including workers' family members, faced secondary exposure at home. Environmental exposure happened in communities that mined or processed asbestos. Quick fact: asbestos removal is highly regulated, and the government fines people and businesses that ignore the rules. Workplace asbestos exposure is still a hazard at job sites where safety procedures are not followed. Past occupational exposure. The risk for asbestos-related illnesses is highest for people who worked with the raw mineral or with asbestos-containing products on a daily basis. High-risk occupations: shipyard workers, construction workers, power plant workers, chemical plant workers, industrial workers, insulators, boiler workers, auto mechanics. Risk factors in present-day jobs. Construction tradesmen and firefighters can be exposed to asbestos while working in old homes and structures built with contaminated materials. Exposure can happen during a renovation, demolition or disaster response. When old buildings are destroyed without safety precautions, airborne asbestos fibers can contaminate the surrounding area. Even new buildings contain asbestos products such as roofing materials. Firefighters, contractors, demolition workers, electricians and plumbers are at high risk of exposure to asbestos in old buildings. Second-hand exposure. When the asbestos industry was booming, families of workers were also at great risk. Workers often came home with asbestos fibers on their hair, work clothes, shoes and tools. This exposed family members to the toxic substance and increased their risk for mesothelioma and related diseases. Environmental exposure. Because asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral, people living near large deposits in hilly or mountainous regions also face exposure. Minimal amounts of the mineral can fill the air in these regions. Still, environmental exposure is most dangerous near former asbestos mines. Read more testimonials. How does mesothelioma develop? Mesothelioma can develop as a result of DNA damage caused by asbestos fibers. Once asbestos is inhaled, the body has a hard time getting rid of the fibers. The fibers become lodged in tissues and accumulate with repeated exposure. After many years, these fibers may cause cancerous changes to surrounding cells. Mesothelioma starts in mesothelial cells, which make up the protective membranes of the mesothelium that cover the lungs, abdomen and heart. 4 stages of mesothelioma: tumors forming on the lungs. Tumors tend to form a sheath around the affected lung. DNA damage caused by asbestos fibers. Inflamed cells, fibers inflame and irritate mesothelial cells, leading to irreversible scarring, cellular damage and cancer. Genetic changes, fibers enter mesothelial cells and disrupt their life cycle, causing genetic changes that lead to cancer. Cancerous mutations, asbestos causes the production of free radicals, which are molecules that damage DNA and cause healthy cells to mutate. Uncontrolled growth, the fibers trigger the production of oncoproteins, which block genes that protect cells from growing uncontrollably and forming tumors. Check link in description for great offers. Other mesothelioma risk factors. Exposure to other fibrous minerals such as aragonite. Exposure to radiation. Receiving a polio vaccine between 1955 and 1963 that was contaminated with simian virus 40 SV40. Genetic factors that increase the likelihood of developing cancer. Asbestos.com Mesothelioma Guide. Free mesothelioma guide tailored to your diagnosis. Select you or your loved one's diagnosis to get a free mesothelioma guide with the right information for you and your family. Differences between mesothelioma causes and risk factors. A risk factor is anything that increases the odds of developing a disease. A cause is the contributing factor that leads to a disease. For example, although men are much more likely to develop mesothelioma than women, gender alone cannot cause the cancer. Often, multiple risk factors are involved in the development of mesothelioma. The duration of asbestos exposure plays a role. While the World Health Organization says no amount of asbestos exposure is safe, it is usually heavy, repeated exposure over many years that leads to asbestos-related illnesses. A study in the American Journal of Epidemiology found the longer someone works in a job that involves asbestos exposure, the higher their risk of mesothelioma becomes. The link between asbestos exposure and mesothelioma is so strong that it can be difficult for researchers to tell if any other risk factors can cause mesothelioma on their own. Although scientists continue to study this topic, and they know other fibrous minerals cause mesothelioma, exposure to asbestos remains the most clearly defined cause. Is smoking a risk factor for mesothelioma? No, studies show cigarette smoking is not a risk factor for mesothelioma. However, those who smoke and are regularly exposed to asbestos are much more likely to develop asbestos-related lung cancer. Some studies reveal that smokers exposed to asbestos are upwards of 90 times more likely to develop lung cancer. Researchers also found smoking can weaken lungs and reduce the body's ability to dispose of asbestos fibers trapped inside. Smoking also aggravates asbestosis. Preventing and detecting mesothelioma. The best way to prevent mesothelioma is to follow workplace safety regulations and protect yourself by learning more about how you might be exposed to asbestos at work and at home. Be cautious of materials in old homes that may contain asbestos. If you think a past job or home repair project exposed you to asbestos, you should seek regular medical exams to check for signs of asbestos-related diseases. If you or a loved one has a history of asbestos exposure, especially in the workplace, don't wait for symptoms to arise. Instead, be proactive and talk to your doctor. Early detection offers the best opportunity for effective mesothelioma treatment. Common questions about mesothelioma causes. Is asbestos the only cause of mesothelioma? According to the American Cancer Society, 80% of mesothelioma cases are caused by known exposure to asbestos. Studies have shown that radiation treatment for other cancers or certain genetic markers may increase the risk of developing mesothelioma. However, asbestos remains the only proven cause of the disease. Who is at risk for mesothelioma? Occupational asbestos exposure is the primary cause of mesothelioma. Construction workers, firefighters, industrial workers, power plant workers and shipyard workers have the greatest risk of asbestos exposure. Wives and children of blue-collar workers are at risk of secondary asbestos exposure and mesothelioma. Men who worked with asbestos would often carry fibers home on their skin, hair, clothes and tools. How much exposure to asbestos is harmful? There is no safe amount of exposure to asbestos due to the size and shape of asbestos fibers. The risk of developing mesothelioma is greater with increased exposure to asbestos. Trace amounts of asbestos on clothes and skin are enough to cause mesothelioma by secondary exposure. Check link in description for great offers. What should I do if I think I am developing mesothelioma? If you are experiencing respiratory symptoms or other signs of mesothelioma and have a history of asbestos exposure, talk with your physician about being screened for the disease. Mesothelioma doctors will order CT imaging and other tests based on your history of asbestos exposure to determine if you are developing mesothelioma.